Hi everyone, my name is Mary and this is my final project for Research Methods. The title is Coerced Confessions and Their Influence on the Verdict. It's the same title as my research paper. So this is what we're covering today and the order we're going to cover it in. So the abstract is just an overview of the whole thing. We're basically studying confessions and guilty verdicts and their relationship via two questions that we're going to be asking. We are researching interactions between confessions and verdicts. Do different types of confessions influence the verdict? If so, how? Or what is the likelihood the verdict will be guilty depending on how the confession was attained, if at all? To address our queries, we must first research other studies conducted on human behavior and motivation, specifically in regards to interrogations and confessions. First, we're going to look at the Wells research. Wells tells us that both reward and punishment are equal motivators. Next, we're going to look at the Kaysen and Newman study. This tells us that confessions, the type of confession, does matter in the eyes of the jury. Lastly, the Rusano study tells us that confessions attained by coercion lead to more convictions. So we're going to do our own study to see what we find. We're going to give our participants a criminal case for them to read through, and then they're going to answer two questions about the case. They do not know there are 4 variations of the case. So since coercions yield more confessions, we also believe that they will yield more guilty votes. We believe that both independent variables will influence the verdict in some way. So in order to figure this out, we have 2 questions. The first is going to be, does the nature of a confession influence the verdict of a case? This is basically like how the confession was attained, and if that affects anything. The second is if the circumstance of each confession affects the likelihood of a guilty verdict. So like, is the juror or mock juror going to be influenced by the circumstance of the confession? And if their likelihood is going to be based on that. So for our methods section, we're going to start with our sample size. We have a pretty good sample size in terms of numbers. We had 116 total participants. Only 94 were valid though. In order to maintain the quality of the sample, we did have to omit about 22 participants from the study, and this was because the packets were not labeled, so we didn't know where their responses were coming from. This is our demographics. Our median age happened to be almost 41 years of age. We had way more females than we did males in this study. On ethics, everyone received and signed consent, and they could opt out at any time. For the second part of our methods section, we're going to be talking about the surveys themselves. These are the packets that were handed out to the participants so that they could fill them out and answer questions. Our first survey is Survey A. It's our control, which means there was no confession in this storyline. Our second survey was labeled B, and this was a voluntary confession. Survey C was a coerced confession with promises of leniency. And Survey D was coercion, but threatening instead of leniency. So after we got back all the pamphlets, we decided to run some numbers and record our data. So in this figure, you can see that we found that the Survey C, which was coercion and leniency, got the most guilty votes, and it was the only one to get more guilty than not guilty. This graph shows the results from the likelihood question, and as you can see, there is not much difference between all of the surveys, so we decided it was insignificant, no correlation. We ran a statistical analysis on the data as well. we ran a chi-square test. So the chi-square test to see if variables are related, and the ANOVA test tests for significant differences in data. So it means we use the variance. Basically, it just tells us if the likelihood of guilt was related to the type of confession. So basically what we learned was that our study aligned with the Wells study, it was congruent with the Kaysen study, and the Rusana research backs up what we found in our study as well, which means we did a pretty good job. So even though there was no significant interaction between the variables, Survey C basically backs up the rest of the studies that we covered in the introduction. So now that we have all this information, we need to know what we can do with it. Obviously, we could expand upon it and gain a comprehensive insight on interrogation methods and their effect on how a jury will perceive a confession. This would aid in criminal justice reform, which is greatly needed, and here is why. So the way our criminal justice system works is quite a mess. We have the potential to have almost 230,000 people in jail right now for crimes that they did not commit. Here's that fact further broken down into different categories. Basically, this just means there's a lot of people in jail that shouldn't be there, and most of them are marginalized populations, specifically Black American males, but there's a variety of reasons for this. Many of the reasons stem from a for-profit criminal justice system and privatized prisons. Next, I've just included some citations for the studies that we covered in the introduction, as well as some other studies that I used in my research paper. And to close, here's a quote by Albert Einstein that I kept as a sample slide. The end. I don't know why I just liked it.